Hey guys, Sam from Meadow Rabbits here, and today I want to follow up on the most recent video I posted, which was why you should raise meat rabbits instead of chickens. Now that video did very well and I got a lot of great comments, but I also got some interesting pushback from a lot of people. Now I'd say roughly 60 to 70% of those comments were people who were maybe misunderstanding what I was saying and missed those important caveats at the beginning of the video, which I can understand. It was a very long video, so maybe not everybody fully understood my comparison. However, a good chunk of those comments also had some fairly valid criticism that I wanted to address today, and the subject of today's video is the exact opposite of the last one, and that is why chickens are better than meat rabbits. Now again, before we get into the details, time for a caveat. I 100% stand by what I said in the original video when it came to the Cornish cross or similar meat birds, even the more natural ones like the Red Rangers. I think that the average small producer, somebody who is looking to either homestead, get into a little bit of self-sufficiency, maybe a bit of prepping, has no business raising those birds. I covered in detail why I think that's the case in the other video, so if you haven't seen that, go check it out now. But long story short, those birds are really best left to professional farmers who are doing this as a living because, I mean, if you want to raise them for fun, by all means go ahead, but you're going to be spending a lot more money and a lot more time for a lot less meat than you would if you were using, say, meat rabbits. Now, full disclaimer here, I am not anti-chicken. I love chickens. Believe it or not, I got my first flock of chickens when I was in 3rd grade. My parents thought I was totally insane. I read every book on chickens out there, including the old Stories Guide to Raising Chickens. I made a big presentation on why they should let me get chickens. And they did, but I took care of them every single day. Not once did they come outside to do anything for those chickens. It was all me. And I had laying flocks growing up throughout that entire time. But as I covered in my previous video, meat birds specifically built for meat, which is very few breeds of chicken, are a whole different animal and are not really going to be successful for somebody on the small scale. I mean, you could do it, but it's not going to be worth it, in my opinion, and I explained that in the other video. Another thing to keep in mind here is that we've got a super diverse audience here at West Meadow Rabbits. I've got people from literally pretty much every continent except Antarctica who watch my videos and comment on them, and so cultural contexts are really different depending on where you are in the world. I've also got a lot of diverse people as far as where they're living and what kind of acreage they have. For context, I live in suburban Massachusetts, very close to a major city, Boston, and it's in the US. So a huge majority of my customers are living in a similar area. We're talking 1 acre or less lots, very strict rules. It's a very tightly regulated state. A lot of it is under the radar. You've got a lot of people who are really anti-agriculture, at least in their backyard here. So most of the customers I see are coming from that context and are looking for a solution in that context, which again informs a lot of my videos. That being said, I also think that what I have to say broadly holds true across the board. So today we are going to talk about why dual-purpose hens are better than meat rabbits. And I'm not going to come off as strongly as I did in the last video because I'm less confident about this claim. I'm going to do more of a pros and cons. Now, I have years of experience with laying hens. I've done a couple different types of fowl before. And I have obviously a ton of experience in meat rabbits, so I'm not making this stuff up. Furthermore, I've worked on farms that do this as a commercial living. So let's talk a little bit about what a dual-purpose breed is, what its history is, and how it fits into the modern context. Historically, a dual-purpose breed was a quote-unquote homestead or farm chicken that could survive with very little babying, was an aggressive forager, could easily reproduce on its own, raise its own chicks under the hen, and survive off of forage and scraps with some grain supplementation, especially in the winter. Classic dual-purpose hens that you may think of if you're in the American context are Rhode Island Reds, Barred Rocks, New Hampshire Reds, any of those common chickens with the large bodies but also good egg-laying capacity. These chickens would more or less hang around the homestead or farm, fend for themselves with a little bit of supplementation from the farmer or homesteader, and they would reproduce themselves with the farmer getting their fryers from culls, young roosters, or if they had too many chickens, just culling those, and then the chickens laying eggs for many years, and if the farmer noticed the chicken was slowing down in production or just wanted to eat a stewer, they would take one of those laying hens. Now, a lot of the comments I got were from people in different countries pointing out that this is still how chickens are broadly raised in those countries, no need for hatcheries, and that's fair, point taken. But these chickens are very, very different than what your typical American is accustomed to eating. You're not getting a 5-pound bird at 8 weeks. It's going to take much longer for your fryers to mature. The birds themselves are going to be smaller. They're going to lay less eggs. They're not going to have the double breast that Americans are accustomed to, and all these other little things along the line. Not to say there's anything wrong with that, but you cannot compare the production of a dual-purpose heritage breed being raised in a traditional context with a factory farm genetically optimized meat bird. And even a pasture-raised Cornish cross in a Salatin-style chicken tractor is still going to blow a heritage breed out of the water. That being said, I still think there's a ton of merit to raising chickens this way, so without further ado, let's get right into the pros. Okay, so pro number one, while slightly subjective, I think is really important, and that is that I think chicken meat tastes a little better than rabbit meat. It's not to say that rabbit meat has a bad taste, it doesn't have much of any taste. That's mostly because rabbit is an incredibly lean meat. Now, for a lot of us fat Americans, that's a really good thing. We're looking for high protein, extremely low calorie diets because we have a way caloric surplus where we are. Now, the downside to that lower amount of fat, though, is not that you're going to get rabbit starvation, which is another comment I got a lot of, unless you're eating rabbit 365 days a year, and even then. But the lack of fat does affect the flavor. Like a lot of us, I grew up eating chicken, and the taste of chicken has a lot of fond memories for me. It's used in a lot of recipes in a certain way. While that can be substituted with rabbit meat, it's not quite the same. I also think that generally speaking, chicken is somewhat easier to cook because it has at least that little bit ingrown fat, especially the dark meat. Whereas rabbit, you have to be somewhat more concerned about how you're cooking it so you don't dry the meat out too much. Now, this is not entirely true for chicken, especially chicken breast, which is much more comparable to rabbit meat. And if you're raising breeds in heritage breeds, the meat is going to be much less fatty, much thinner, and maybe a little more gamey than, say, an 8-week-old Cornish cross, especially if it's an older hen. Now, it also has a stronger flavor that some people really like, including myself, but it's something to keep in mind. Now, moving on to pro number two, which pretty much everybody pointed out in the comments of the last video, is that chickens, in theory, can be dual use. So, rabbits obviously don't lay eggs. Eggs are an incredibly important protein source for a lot of people. Egg laying is very, very efficient. It's second only to dairy in efficiency for getting protein, not meat per se, but animal-derived protein. And it's incredibly important in a variety of dishes, and I frankly couldn't imagine life without eggs. So Cornish cross is obviously not a dual-use chicken, and a leghorn egg-laying chicken is definitely not a dual-use chicken. But the heritage dual-use chickens like the Rhode Island Red or the Barred Rock are technically giving you a 2-for-1. Now, you can either buy hatching eggs or straight-run chicks. Even though you're still dependent on the hatchery, you'll get them for cheaper. And you can raise those roosters and cull them at 3-4 months as your fryers. If you're breeding your own chickens, this is even easier. So what you're getting basically is some of the chickens up front as fryers and culls, and then throughout the chicken's life you're getting stewing hens and roasting hens as the hens age, stop laying eggs, or you just need to cull them for some reason. And the heritage breed dual use chickens have been built well enough that they're not going to compete with the leghorn as far as egg laying capacity goes, but there's also enough meat on them to make it worth it to butcher them, unlike, say, a leghorn. This, in my mind, is really the biggest advantage of chickens, especially on a smaller scale. And I'm going to cover a little bit more on the con side because there is no such thing as being great at everything. However, the fact that it is an option, especially if you wanted to breed your own, is really important. Moving on to pro number 3. Chickens are omnivorous. Now, you may not think this is actually a pro, especially when I spend a significant amount of time on this channel and in the last video harping on how meat rabbits can take nutritionally devoid leaves and plant material that chickens would at best get maybe 5% nutrition out of, and they can basically survive off that and turn it into meat. However, chickens are very, very useful because they're omnivorous, especially in a small scale context. If you're in a 1 to 2 acre lot, you definitely don't have room for a pig, especially in the suburbs. And what that means is that chickens can take a lot of those scraps that rabbits would not be able to eat and can convert that into eggs and protein. So, for example, when you're butchering a rabbit, oftentimes you'll get the skeleton, you'll have cleaned off as much meat as you can, and there's still little bits of meat hanging on there. If you threw that out to your chickens, they would pick it clean down to the bone and maybe even eat some of the bone. The same thing goes with any other meat scraps, dairy scraps, fruit scraps, these kind of things that you can't really feed to rabbits but still have nutritional value. Chickens can capture that value. And even if you have a dog like me and you're feeding organs to your dog, there's some stuff you really shouldn't be feeding a dog, say like intestines, that chickens will happily eat. Furthermore, I know a lot of people have talked about the laying hens surviving off compost, which I think, to be fair, is completely overblown. Richard Perkins has a good video where he visited the compost company up in Vermont that does it. The fact of the matter is they have a very small, relatively speaking, small flock of chickens that are surviving off the compost, but they're getting tons and tons, literal tons of compost in per day to sustain a flock of chickens that is laying far below where a grain-fed chicken would lay. That being said, it's not nothing, again, and if you have even a small compost pile, your chickens will be able to extract some nutrients out of that, both from the scraps and the worms that may be in there. In my mind, this is one of the strongest cases for laying hens, is that they are a fantastic complement to meat rabbits. Again, in the video, I talked about the cases where I think meat rabbits are better, especially if you can't have chickens because they're too noisy, too smelly. They want a free range, and you can't do that because you're in a city. But if you have the room, I would absolutely recommend keeping laying hens with meat rabbits, because the laying hens will go through these manure piles and they will eat the worms in there. They will pick any beetles that might be coming up and bothering your rabbits. They will pick up any pellets that the rabbits drop. They will recycle the rabbit carcasses, guts, and pick the hides clean of meat for your rabbits, and they will work very nicely together in that system, basically acting as the compost part of your little homestead if you can't have a pig. So they fit very nicely into that system. Now, my final pro here is chickens are somewhat easier emotionally to deal with, especially at processing time. The unfortunate reality is, in the US and a lot of other countries, there's a cuteness factor around rabbits. If you tell people you raise meat rabbits, unless they're very open-minded, you're probably going to get some looks. Now, with chickens, everybody eats chickens. There's chicken nuggets at McDonald's. People might think you're a little weird for raising them in your backyard and butchering them, but they're not going to think you're some kind of evil monster. And that also goes for you. Chickens are not mammals. They are very strange looking, and while I think they can be cute, funny, and even beautiful at times, they're not as cute as a rabbit. It's much easier to process a chicken than it is a rabbit, especially if you're not used to it. And if you have little kids that haven't been growing up around eating animals, they can really have a hard time with the rabbits. And overall, it's just more culturally acceptable. This, to me, I was debating putting it on a pro because it's kind of annoying, but it is also a fact of life that we live in and needs to be acknowledged. So the first major con with chickens is kind of counteracting what I said in the pros, and that, at least in the US, most dual-use breeds aren't really dual-use anymore. Now, we need to understand that for a while, chicken raising was really declining in popularity in the US from the 50s to roughly the early 2000s. Small farms were disappearing, industrial agriculture was consolidating, and there were less and less chickens being raised and focusing more and more on these hyper-efficient varieties like the Cornish cross or the Leghorn, so the dual-use chickens were kind of disappearing. Now, around when I got my chicken flock for the first time, the chicken renaissance was sort of happening where everybody was wanting to raise backyard chickens. There's a catch, though. People want chickens in their backyard primarily for eggs. Lots and lots of people, I would argue the majority of people who have backyard chicken flocks, aren't butchering their chickens, at least not on their property. They're primarily interested in eggs. So the hatcheries, who did a great job, and I'm very thankful that they kept these breeds around, also bred them to be optimized more for egg laying because that's what people wanted. One of the things I harp on a lot in this channel as far as genetics is concerned is that a breed is not the only thing that matters. It's not the end of the story. It's actually arguably more important that the line is productive and designed for what you want to do. So you can have two different lines of, say, Rhode Island Reds, one optimized for egg production and one optimized for meat production. While technically the same breed, they're going to have really different performance metrics on each of those goals. They're going to look different, they're going to mature differently, and the more extreme the line has been bred, the more difference that is going to have. So I put this as a con because most of the chickens in the US have been optimized for egg production, which has harmed their meat producing ability. Now, it's not to the point where it's like a Rhode Island Red is like a Leghorn, although some lines are very Leghorn-like. You could still get some meat out of them, and there are ways around this. In fact, one thing I would love to do someday, if I ever could quit my day job, would be to get back into breeding chickens, and I would love to grow a more balanced dual-purpose line. There are chicken breeders out there that are independent and may have more optimized lines, but from a standard factory chicken, especially a popular heritage breed, while it is still technically dual use, it's going to be much more optimized for egg production. Now, my second and last con is going to sort of be a combination of everything I discussed in that original video. Besides the egg laying stuff and what I mentioned, all my other points still stand. Chickens are more noisy than rabbits. They're more smelly than meat rabbits. They technically need more space than meat rabbits. They like to free range. The feathers are a ridiculous pain to deal with. It's bad enough with the Cornish cross, which has specifically been bred to have very little feathers to make processing easier. A heritage breed dual-use hen is going to have a ton of feathers, and they are going to be in there good. So plucking chickens is still a nightmare for me, regardless of how you're doing it. Furthermore, for most people in most contexts, there's no way you're going to be able to feed a chicken without grain. It's difficult enough doing it with meat rabbits. It's definitely doable, but it's difficult. Supplementing even 50% of their diet with free forage is still tricky, but definitely doable. With chickens, it is much, much harder. There's absolutely no way you're going to be able to, in a suburban context, generate enough scraps to sustain your chickens like how they do in Vermont at the composting facilities. It would be too smelly, too messy, and just a total disaster. In addition, your 1 acre lot is not going to be able to produce enough bugs and calorically dense food for your chickens to eat unless you've got maybe like 1 or 2 laying hens, which is enough for one person, but it's worth pointing out. Whereas a 1 acre lot can sustain enough meat rabbits to feed your family like 60% or more of their meat needs if you wanted to eat that much rabbit. But that dovetails nicely into my final thought here, which is, why not both? Again, I stand by what I said in that rabbits are better for meat, and you really should consider strongly not doing it if you're going to raise a Cornish cross at a smaller scale. It'll be easier for you and more efficient just to buy it from your local farmer. That being said, egg-laying hens and meat rabbits are a fantastic team. Right out of the gate, the deal breaker for me is that rabbits can't lay eggs. You need a source of eggs. Eggs are delicious. Eggs are incredibly important to almost every culinary tradition, and not having them would be a huge loss to me. Furthermore, I really enjoy chicken meat. It is a premium product to me, and while I don't use my chickens, or haven't used my chickens and won't in the future, use them primarily for meat, I appreciate a stewer every once in a while. It's nice to make chicken soup the old-fashioned way. Is it a ridiculous pain to butcher them? Absolutely. Will I get the majority of my chicken from a farm? Absolutely. But it's still nice to have, and in a situation where, you know, crap kind of hit the fan, it's still nice to have a few laying hens around to kind of act as recyclers for you, to kind of give you some fat that the rabbits may not necessarily have, and to give you eggs. There's also no question that when times are good and we can afford to feed grain to animals and lose a ton of that grain in the process, chickens are more popular. And this is because it's more of a luxury product than rabbit is. It's slightly more appetizing. It's got a little bit more fat, and people just seem to enjoy eating it a little bit more. But the exact opposite is true during bad times. During World War II, during the 70s inflation, and during the crazy times we're in right now, rabbit popularity skyrockets. And this is because rabbits are able to survive off less and give more. Granted, it's not quite as nice as chicken in many people's eyes, but it is much more efficient, and again, it is much more able to work with resources that people have on the ground and are not expensive and are easy to obtain. Ultimately, I think chickens and rabbits are designed to work together. The laying hens do what the rabbits cannot by producing eggs and eating omnivorous scraps, and the rabbits can turn very low value products into quality meat in a better way than chickens can. I still stand by what I said in both this video and the other video, in that I don't think meat-specific chickens are a very good idea for most people. I say leave that to the sustainable farmers, because you're not going to be able to raise them in a crap-hits-the-fan scenario anyways. However, laying hens, heritage breed hens, if you've got the space, a little breeding project where you optimize your chickens to your circumstances, these are all great options to do. At the end of the day, guys, I've had chickens before. I will have them again in the future, and I think they're great animals. I really like having them around, even if they are a little less efficient. I love their behavior. I think they're really beautiful, and I think they are just fun to have, and I do think they really do have their uses. Ultimately, what you guys want to do for your unique situation is totally up to you. I cannot speak to everybody's situation. I'm just located where I am. I have the experience that I have, and I'm here to share that experience. If you come from a totally different context and you've got totally different experiences, feel free to share those too. I think that it's good if we all share, and you can be influenced by my experience and think of things you may not have thought of, and I can see your experience and think of things I might not have thought of. But you shouldn't take what I say as the end-all be-all for a gigantic planet with 7 billion people on it and think this is the only right way to do things. But if you do see yourself in this experience and you see yourself in a similar context, by all means, take everything that you find useful. Either way, guys, I hope you at least found the video interesting, maybe entertaining. If you did, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. If you want to chat, feel free to leave me a comment down below. And otherwise, I will see you in the next one. Thanks so much.